Are states able to stay neutral today in an increasingly hostile world? And why are some small nations able to act with relative impunity on the global stage while others are punished for minor acts of aggression? And how will the security over raw materials shape the future of public and private relationships, specifically in the Western world? Today, we get into all of this stuff. My guest is Pascal Lottaz. He is an expert and geopolitical analyst. He's the founder of Neutrality Studies, the world's first research organization focused on neutrality as a stance for global states, meaning they're not aligned with the West or the East. They're playing the center and doing it sustainably. This is the Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the greatest minds in geopolitics and finance. Here is Pascal Lottaz. Enjoy.
This is Jay Martin.
All right, here I am with Pascal Lottaz. Pascal, it's great to see you. Looking forward to seeing you next week in Japan, but great to have you on the program today.
Thank you very much for having me again. And likewise, looking forward to catching up over dinner with you.
So lots to talk about. Where I'd like to start is, we've just come off the heels of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit, and lots of performative displays on stage, I would say, from the military parade through to the two Koreas shaking hands on stage. There's a lot of messaging, I felt like, from this meeting. Did you interpret it that way, Pascal? I guess reviewing and reflecting on how you watched that meeting and the outcomes and the takeaways from it, give me your thoughts. What's material? What's just noise and symbolism?
Well, as with most of these meetings, also if you think about the G7 and others, optics is always very important. These leaders, put a lot of emphasis on looking good on stage. All of them want that naturally. That's because that's just in their natural. These leaders, they seek the limelight. That's the one thing. On the other, it also conveys messages. And as much as these meetings are about brainstorming or diplomacy and cooperation, organization, they're also about signaling to each other and to the outside world what to expect. I mean, the aspirations, and especially for the SCO, I would say this, the point that they made is that there really is now more games in town than just the traditional Western G7, NATO, EU approach, and that actually, the SCO had very low profile for now quite a long time. This is the first time that in my perception we've got a meeting that was this well covered and that had this much impact, because the last couple of years, the SCO was overshadowed very largely by BRICS. And these two are complementary, I would say, but they're different. They have a different genesis and different origin, and and they have slightly different emphasis of what these cooperation schemes are supposed to do. And this year, it seems to me, or my interpretation is that the participating SCO states agreed that they want not a grand entry, but a kind of a re-entry into saying, like, look, this is also important. And they succeeded at that. Also with the parade, which also, of course, coincided with the 80th anniversary of China's victory, Russian US victory in the Second World War. So they combined all of that in order to create a grand spectacle and kind of give the SCO the gravitas that apparently the member states, especially Russia and China, decided it should have, and establish it also as this second pillar to this new multipolar world besides the BRICS. And I think that was a smart move, because sometimes, if you focus too much on only the BRICS forum, you risk that you lose sight of the other opportunities. And the SCO definitely is one. The big difference between the two is that BRICS is mainly a economic forum, very akin to the G7, where the original idea is that, okay, let's just the large economies, let's put our heads together and figure out how, if we all push in the same direction, how we can achieve more together. Whereas the SCO has same components, but then it also has a security component, right? And a cooperation component in the security realm, especially if in the realm of anti-terrorism. And the SCO is nothing like NATO, nothing like a military alliance, but it has different arms and it is more formalized. So I found it a good idea to emphasize the fact that, oh, by the way, there's this second gathering place and meeting space that we can also use and should use and will probably use in the future with also slightly different members, so that you create an overlapping net of, how to build the multipolarity.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, I wanted to start with that question and next get into the concept of neutrality, which is your area of focus. And here's where I want to come at this. We've seen the two major superpowers make a lot of declarations lately, right? Some positive, some negative. From the West, it's mainly been trade aggression, negotiations, and demand. And from the East, it's been a bit of a show of here's the alternative, right? Here's what we can do for you. Here's another place where your economy and trade relationships and military reliance can land, right?
Right.
Would you be able to share a list of companies, maybe like even Australia, that are kind of threading the needle right now and that they're maintaining trade relationships with both China and the US to largely equal degree, even if they're, verbally aligned with the West, right? America is a friend, China is a customer, as they said, which is kind of a silly thing to say, but love to know your thoughts on that. But, these two superpowers right now, I feel like, are jockeying for the favor of the neutral states. Would you agree with that? And if so, what would those neutral states be?
So on the one hand, yes, they're vying for more support from the neutrals, but they do it in a very different way. So the US and Europe are still in the habit of threatening the others, saying like, if you don't join our camp, then beware of what's going to come your way. We are seeing this very clearly by the way the EU, for instance, approaches Georgia, and the US approaches Georgia. And I know Georgia, if you're not following the news in the Caucasus, it's not on your radar all the time. But Georgia has carved out for itself a very clearly neutralist foreign policy to go forward. Just to recap, right, 2008, they had a small war with Russia after, as by now is clear, a Swiss diplomat actually wrote the entire report about this. It was the Georgian side that fired the first shots, and then from there things spiraled into a short war. And from there, Georgia kind of, at that point in 2008, was completely West aligned with that government under Mr. Saakashvili. And once he was out of power, the Georgia voted in a new government, fair and open elections. Nobody contests that. And that government, the Georgian Dream, since 2012, has been steering Georgia back into a more neutralist position. Now the US and Europe keep saying, oh, this is a pro-Russian government, which it is not. My Georgian friends keep telling me nobody needs to teach the Georgians how to dislike Russians because of the very long history. But a large majority of Georgians has no interest in providing any kind of pretext to Russia to invade again, right? So they don't want to be a second Ukraine. So they've been trying to have a somewhat a great relationship with the EU. They would still love to join the EU because that's for economic purposes very important. But on the other hand, do not antagonize Russia. The EU keeps saying, oh, but you were so friendly to Russia. And the Georgians keep saying, but look, we don't even have official diplomatic relations. We are not having any Russian ambassadors here, and no vice versa. We still are in a large dispute about our territories. We just don't want to escalate against them more. We just don't want to make things even worse for ourselves. And, the EU and Europe have been putting a tremendous the EU and the US have been putting a lot of pressure, including of course, organized street protests through NGOs, and that has been happening in December 2012. Now this failed, but the strategy is still put put pressure, not so use the stick, not the carrot, right? Or if a carrot, then a very small one and a very big stick. And unfortunately, the West has been very used to this kind of strategy. In other places in East Asia, we've also seen recently large protests, and one where Indonesia, for example, Nepal, in South Asia, and now most recently in the Philippines. And some people in our community are discussing, could this be a form of, a Western color revolution taking place? I cannot choose right now what to believe, because all three instances don't. On the one hand, there is some rationale why that could be the case. On the other hand, they don't look like it. I mean, if it is instigated or partially instigated by the West, then I would still need to see the proof for what actual mechanisms, other than a few NGOs that got support from American donors. There are always NGOs involved in this, I must say, though. Brian Beletic talked about this, but just showing that a couple of institutions that are anti-government get US funding is not enough yet in order to say, like, this is a large-scale attack. So, I mean, we need to be very careful, but we need to be careful with this one. But it could be that also in East Asia, we have this approach of the big stick and the small carrot going on. Now, on the other hand, we do have BRICS and the SCO that are trying to basically use a big carrot. And so far, I haven't really seen sticks very much. A little bit. There are examples where, Russia decided to announce that Vladimir Putin would visit Mongolia last year, November, December last year, and, have a friendly state visit to Mongolia. And the problem is Mongolia is a member of the International Criminal Court. So under the ICC, under the Rome Statute, Mongolia would have been under the obligation to arrest Vladimir Putin, right? Because Putin has a warrant out. But obviously, little 2 million people Mongolia will not arrest the leader of its largest neighbor, right, of Russia. Obviously, that will not happen. And Russia just said, look, we're going to visit you. This is what's going to happen. And Mongolia said, okay, fine. So we are going to be the first state to break the Rome Statute, but there's nothing we can do. So that's an instance of, a small stick approach to just say, like, we are going to set an example and you have to take it. And Mongolia understood that and took it and actually made the best out of it for its own diplomacy. And it was, in fact, it's going very well for Mongolia. As we saw at the SCO, it was revealed that this Power of Siberia 2 pipeline would not go around Mongolia from Russia into China, which would be a possibility, will go through Mongolia, which is very good for Mongolia, because you can benefit. Basically, all you need to do is to give a couple of plots of land in order to get billions of dollars in revenue, right, in the future. So that's really great for Mongolia as a not just economically, but also security wise. It makes sure that the energy future of Russia and China, at least for a little part, also depends upon Mongolia. So it makes them structurally more important, which is great. So these things are developing at the same time. But in my view, the SCO countries, the BRICS countries, they try to first and foremost advertise the benefits of being a member, the benefits of cooperation, especially the BRICS. BRICS is so popular right now that it even had to create different membership categories in order not to overburden itself, because each full member also has de facto veto power. So if you grow that club, you need to make sure that you don't incapacitate yourself accidentally. So they made a membership category being like so a full member, and the other one is called a associated, or well, the idea is the same, just being associated. So you contribute to the club, but when it comes to voting rights and how to go forward, you're not on exactly the same plane. In return, you don't occur the exact same obligations to carry all of the policies forward. So with this said, I think this game is going on at the moment. And when it comes to companies, I'm sorry, I don't follow the precise economic situation as closely as you do. I really only know of a couple of, basically only the tech sector that comes to mind, although there must be others, right? I mean, the oil, the mineral industry must also be playing, must be looking at this very strongly and try to tread the middle ground in order to keep access. I guess market, not only market access, but also, investment access must be huge on the thinking of a lot of companies. The only one I can give you an example of is the tech sector with, basically what Apple is doing. Apple is like now doing this balancing game of still trying, they invested for 15, 20 years into China to manufacture there, designed in California, produced in China, right? They then, when the trade spat between China and the US started heating up, already under Obama, it got clear because Obama announced a pivot to Asia that there might be problems on the horizon. But then under Trump 1, this got very explicit, and they started to invest into India to have basically another place to shift production to if necessary, and also just diversify the production portfolio, I guess, which also makes sense. Although it seems that in India they hit like a new set of problems, which is absolutely expected, right? These jurisdictions and these countries and these cultures just have different challenges if you want to produce there. And by now we are seeing that the pressure on Apple is even larger, with the US, the President Trump basically demanding to meet Tim Cook and tell him, look, you have to invest more over here and produce over here. At the same time, Cook is also able to meet Xi Jinping, actually. And the China obviously values these foreign tech companies for their very own reasons. And Apple is trying to make the best out of it. But the more the trade disputes are increasing, and the more one or both sides are trying to put pressure on the other one by pressuring their companies, the harder it's going to get for these companies. And the more you are entangled in this network, the higher the stakes for yourself. So for Apple, I think it's very high, and they must be doing like geostrategic analysis a lot in order to figure out how to mitigate these risks. On the other hand, it also comes with a lot of opportunities, right? If you have production plans, even redundant production plans, which is something you don't want to have under normal circumstances because it's a waste of money, but in geopolitically tense moments, redundancy can save your behind because you're able to switch one off and the other one on, right? So this building redundancy must be something that they are thinking about, and to serve different markets from different jurisdictions. So the larger companies will have, or do have now, an advantage if you're able to produce in different jurisdictions and then adjust the delivery to the US market depending on the tariff situation, for instance. So I do think that when it comes to the neutrality of these companies will always seek, by the way they are designed, they seek profit maximization and they seek revenue, they seek access, and they have to somehow be neutral in that sense in order to create shareholder value. And I do believe that a lot of them will have to start investing into this, into redundancies in order to mitigate the risks that 10 years ago we weren't thinking about, because 10 years ago the name of the game was still globalization, right? And more access and pressure for ever more access and ever more level playing field. And we are now living in the opposite world. And it's like, okay, fine, got to get used to this.
Yeah, 100%. And, such an interesting point on just the general economic implications of this when we see this, trade war, global competition continue to heat up. And there's two very different strategies at play, right? China's implemented, a state corporate partnership model for a very long time. And this is one of the reasons that many of their companies have become so competitive, when you have access to the pockets of the central bank when you need it, right? More frequently than they do in the West. But we're seeing this occur now in the US much more frequently. And, the US steel deal President Trump negotiated a board seat in the American organization. He can veto decisions at the American plants. The NVIDIA deal, now if NVIDIA sells chips to China, the U.S. government gets a cut. And these are just deals of influence, but the government's also invested directly in certain mining companies like MP Materials to boost the competitive nature of America's rare earth supply, which they need to do if they want to stay competitive, or we're going to end up in some kind of a two-tier commodity system where you can buy the cheap stuff from an adversary or the expensive stuff from an ally. You'll need a really good reason to buy the expensive stuff from an ally, especially as the commodity market continues to heat up. And I think the nickel industry is such a great example of this because, if you look at the nickel price, it's like, Pascal, it's like the one hard commodity where the price has fallen off a cliff right now. Most hard commodities are hitting all-time highs, whether you're looking at gold, silver, copper, uranium. For some reason, the nickel chart is the opposite of that. And the reason is because China invested about $65 billion in Indonesia's nickel market. And they've been able to flood the world with very cheap nickel because nickel comes from Indonesia, Canada, and Australia. And obviously, Canada and Australia can't compete with not just Indonesia's labor prices, but also just the environmental regulation, right? And the Sulawesi Islands, where the nickel comes from, are an absolute disaster from an environmental standpoint. But as a consequence, they're able to get much cheaper nickel to the market, and Indonesia today controls like 65% of the refined nickel industry globally. And just for context, like OPEC at its peak in 1973 only had 55% of the oil market. So 65 is a lot. But the consequence is that they're choking out the Canadian and the Australian providers, taking more market share as Aussie and Canadian miners go on care and maintenance and shut down their mining operations. And so my expectation is that we see government intervention into these projects and maybe subsidization to get Aussie and Canadian miners competitive again, or some kind of a carrot or incentive to get Western allied countries buying Western nickel. This is probably something we're going to see in the future, and it will set precedent for more corporate state partnership in the West. That's my expectation. Any thoughts on that, Pascal?
I think you're right on the money, as they say. It's the current situation, the last few years, and especially the last 1 year, I would say, has driven home, at least to the United States, that you do need to shift focus again on the real economy. The reason one of the reasons NATO is not able to win its war in Ukraine is because they ran out of production capacity for all of these military goods, which is something I would never have thought possible. I thought the military industrial complex in the United States has basically infinite capacity of producing how much ever you want. Turns out that was wrong. There is real economic constraints because of 30 years of deindustrialization in certain sectors. The dependency on modern supply chains. I mean, supply chains today are much more complex than they used to be in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And these modern production entire chains that you create led to this effect that now certain things cannot be produced without input from the other side of the world, and even if that part of the world is really on your adversary's soil. The best example of that we got is how China suddenly made the US realize that, you guys, you need our rare earths. If you want to create these weapons, you need our rare earths. So if you put the absolute maximum pressure that you can think about, then I think they control 96%, right, of that sector, which is even more insane. And they just say, like, okay, fine, no more exports to you guys. Export controls now from now on. And the US backtracked within a week, even Donald Trump, because somebody in the Pentagon must have actually gone to the office and said, like, look, let me show you. Let me show you how important this is and what China is doing right now. And they got the point across. And this is now a very strategic security vulnerability of the US, which I am absolutely certain they are reacting to, and they do exactly what you're saying with nickel. They are now strategically investing and doing this public-private partnerships in order to mitigate those risks, because anything else would just be absolutely completely dumb. And I cannot imagine that the Pentagon and other institutions, including CIA, would let that happen. So you do need to do these kind of investments. You need to refocus on the real economy, access to these goods, access to the supply chains, or control and management of, like, where is all of this stuff sourced from. In order to produce an F-35, you need millions of parts. You need millions of components, and they all need to be produced.
Thousands of rare earth metals.
And thousands of pounds of rare earth metals. And it's just the rare earth is just the one that comes to mind, but there might be other strategic choke points, right, that are other from rare earths that we are just not aware of. And even for the US to figure that out, which ones that are, you need to do almost a forensic analysis, right, of the entire process. So that's just to say that the production environment in this multipolar world where globalization still happens, but it doesn't happen under the same rules anymore that we were used to. This changes a lot, and this means you need to invest into understanding actually how things are being produced. The Europeans, I don't believe, understood this yet. The Europeans, for some reason, they still live in this fantasy world where they think anything can be solved by just throwing money at it. The Americans, I do believe, understood that the real constraints are there. The Chinese understood that from the beginning and still do. The Russians also. The Russians have access to, like, most things, absolutely most things you need in order to run an autarkic economy, although that's not their goal, but their landmass is just so vast, and their resources, including human resources, is so vast, plus then the access to China and Central Asia in general. So long story short, I do think that we are now going to see more emphasis on the real economy, and maybe just maybe also the dangers of financialization. One of the reasons why the US lost so much in its competitive edge in the real economy is because the last 30 years was the big financialization drive that then really hollowed out the real capacity of the country. And I would expect also, if you look at how the rhetoric of Donald Trump and MAGA, and not just Trump, so MAGA, right, how they will shift again, focus on what are we actually able to make versus what can we buy, package, and sell on the markets.
100%. And you just make such a good point. If you view all of these headlines through the lens of real economy, you can see things a lot more clear. Like what can we make, right? When a month and a half ago, President Trump was in Pittsburgh, pounding the podium saying we're going to make Pittsburgh the steel capital of the world again. And maybe that's great. But if you understand how steel is made, and that the most important alloy for stainless steel is nickel, back to that, you can't actually make Pittsburgh the steel capital of the world without the express approval of China. And that's just how global trade has shaken out, and that's how it functions today.
Just one thing, like one of the problems that I see in the vision of the Trump cabinet is that they are longing for the past, right? It's like, we want to go back to the 1950s where this was the case. So Pittsburgh used to be steel capital. Let's go to steel capital. And what you need to do, obviously, is to analyze what the future is gonna look like, and then reverse engineer, right? And that's something that the Chinese are extremely good at. So there's a problem in vision, but that's not to say that the gut feeling of that group of people isn't right. So I do think the gut feeling is right. The question is, how do you get it?
Yeah. And, there's two things at play there, right? When you're focused on 2-year election cycles, you have to tap into people's emotion. And so promising to bring back the golden American days of the 50s is something that resonates with people, and they want back. They want that culture back. And I completely understand why, even if that's not sort of the real politic approach, right? And actually, this brings me to like another point I wanted to ask you about. So at the end of 2025, China will announce their 15th 5-year plan. Right. They've been executing these 5-year plans since the founding of the People's Republic of China. What was that? Around 1949. 1949. Thank you. And if you look at the commitments on a 5-year plan basis back to that point, I think the 14th 5-year plan that we're currently in had like 20 commitments, 20 goals, right? And if you go back to the early years, the goals were very industrial, very heavy industrial, annual coal production, annual grain production, things like this, very heavy industry. Whereas right now it's more focused on like pension plan participation, GDP per capita, much more like sophisticated economic goals. And the next 5-year plan, very focused on high tech, high innovation, AI centric goals, which when I read that, it made me wonder, right? Is one economy hyper focused on the next generation of economic inputs, whereas the current global superpower, or at least regional hegemon, being the U.S., is trying to get back to 1950s advantages, right? And how's that going to shake out? Because that doesn't seem like a good strategy. What's your take?
Well, I mean, you put it correctly. I think part of the rhetoric has to do with like winning voters over. This is something that the top leadership of China just doesn't need to worry about very much. I just had an interesting discussion with a China scholar who explained, look, the Chinese model is actually quite intricate and between the top and the lower levels and so on. But it is pretty clear that on the top level, the system that reigns is meritocracy. So people rise through the ranks, and they have to do so. There are ways around. There is nepotism. There is still forms of corruption that also undermine the system. But at least in theory, the largest part of the vast bureaucracy and political bureaucracy as well has to rise through the ranks. That then allows you to plan differently, whereas in the US, the planning is sometimes, at least when we listen to the political speeches, seems haphazard. But we must not forget that the US too has a vast bureaucratic apparatus, and sometimes we refer to this as the deep state. But any country, any modern state needs a bureaucratic apparatus. It needs the permanence, right, in order to govern itself. And these people also work on plans and on strategies. And the US also has a lot of think tanks. The US has one of the advantages it's got a very, very pluralistic society in which a lot of ideas can be bounced around very, very freely. So I wouldn't say that what the US will be planning over the next decades cannot be viable, and necessarily, what you then end up implementing will be different from the political rhetoric. So it's very difficult for us who do not have access to the also to the bureaucratic arm of policy making to judge what will be actually the economic real strategy, or at least the many economic approaches that the United States will be taking. It's very hard to judge that, but I think overall your depiction is quite accurate. The Chinese try to analyze where the biggest chances for growth are, and then strategically invest in those. And they try to understand where the largest vulnerabilities and mitigate those as well. And if in the process of that, every once in a while, you even need to flatten parts of your economy, they do that. Just recall that 2 or 3 years ago, they completely they cracked down hard on the Chinese gaming market and on a couple of IT industries, IT companies, which is something that would never happen in the US, right? You wouldn't just flatten a profitable part of the economy, but the Chinese decided that this is undesirable because it screws up our plans in other parts, and they did that. So China is able to use more of a heavy hand on the economy because they have the political grip is around the economy, not that like in the US where the economy also has the very strong feedback loop to the point where lobbyists and lobbying groups are an essential part of how the entire system works and then how resources are allocated. So rent seeking in the US is extremely strong. And I'm not entirely sure how that will shape out, I'm not saying the US is doomed, not at all. It actually just for its sheer size and the ability over the last 250 years to shape itself, I wouldn't discount them. But when it comes to strategic decision making, I think the Chinese system just lends itself better to that. So we probably need to observe in the United States what kind of which processes will drive the overall economic output of the US in the future, and not necessarily the speech acts, right? But what cannot go wrong. I mean, if you look at the development of fracking in the US. Fracking was a huge game changer of the way the US also created energy security for itself and became a net energy exporter, including LNG. And there is no chance in the world that the United States will go back on fracking and would fall back to the place where they were in the 1990s. So these kinds of industries, I guess, are detrimental also just because of how the United States works.
Let me ask you, Pascal. I want to ask you what the concept and utility of neutral states, and maybe specifically about Canada, if I could. Canada is a country that, shares the largest land border in the world, on the other side of which is the world's wealthiest and hungriest customer. And Canada is an export nation when managed properly, right? We've got a lot of what the world needs. 25% of the world's softwood lumber, 30% of the world's potash. If you want to grow anything in the world, you need potash. Top 5 producer of copper, nickel, gold, uranium, oil, gas. Now we're a supplier of commodities. That's what Canada is when managed properly. And when managed properly, we come through the 2008 financial crisis with a healthier balance sheet than any G7 nation. We share that land border with the US. That relationship is obvious and natural, right? Mm-hmm. We also have the largest coastline in the world that spans 3 oceans and provides access to every global market, right? And so diversity of customers is very important for Canada, and probably something we could do better, right? Open ourselves up to new markets in the East and elsewhere. What are the challenges of being a neutral state? What are the advantages? And if I could ask you, how would you counsel a country like Canada to play it neutral to its own best interest?
So the kind of neutrality you talk about is the one that I call analytical neutrality. When you look at countries and you say, like, okay, they cannot put their lot 100% behind somebody, right? They need to have some degree of strategic autonomy, and hence you will always be caught in the middle somehow. And this is a position that a lot of countries experience over time. A lot of actors experience. Canada, of course, is a member of NATO, so security-wise, there's no way of talking about Canada as a proper neutral. But economically, as you're absolutely correctly pointing out, it makes a ton of sense for Canada to diversify and to do what I think is the core of that of a neutralist strategy, which is be friends to all and foe to neither, as Thucydides defined it 2,400 years ago. It's like, I think it's the most beautiful definition of that. You just try to make friends on all sides. The problem that you run into automatically is that sometimes your friends fight with each other. So you end up being friends with enemies, and that conflict constellation, as I call it, then creates pressure points on the neutral, because naturally both of the enemies of the quarreling states, and the quarrel can be a hot war, which is the worst form of conflict. It can be a cold war. It can be a trade spat. It can be like just anything where two states directly have a dispute with each other, and you, as a third state, you want to be friendly to both of them and remain neutral toward their dispute. So the advice I would have is that for Canada, try to analyze where the tensions between your friends are, right? Understand make sure that you correctly understand what the tension between China and the United States is actually about, because that has to inform your approach toward both of them. Because what you don't want to do is to add fuel to the fire, and you don't want to anger one by making the other one happy, right? Because naturally, if you're nice to one, the other one's going to say like, "Hey, that's my enemy. Why the hell are you being nice to my enemy?" And in the worst cases during wars, I mean, states even make laws, right? The United States had a Trading with the Enemy Act, and which said like, oh, any third states trading with our enemy is naturally going to have these and these sanctions applied to them. And that is a very unfriendly act toward the neutrals. And it's not fair, but it's just a matter of fact that that's what happens, because it's how the conflict dynamic evolves. So main thing is understand the bilateral tensions, because most we sometimes forget that because we talk about NATO and alliances and this group and that group, but a lot of that is makes you forget that international relations at its core is a bilateral game. It's the game of Canada with all the 192 other states, or 190 odd other states. And some of these bilateral relations are more important than other ones. Obviously, the most crucial one to Canada is that with the United States. But also the bilateral relationship with Mexico is not unimportant. The bilateral relationship with China is not unimportant, and with Europe neither. So you need to keep those in mind, but then try to understand. So at which points, for instance, does the United States have pressure points or issues with the Europeans? Where do they have issues with the Mexicans? And how do I position myself in those disputes in order to make sure that on the one hand, the United States remains calm and fine and good with me. On the other hand, Mexico and the Europeans also stay calm and fine and good with me, because if I achieve that, well, they are most likely to give me access the way that I want, and states are much more willing to cooperate with their friends than with and people they trust than those that they don't. So strategically, you need to make sure that you don't accidentally piss off one because you're nice to the other, and that's just even outside the security realm, right?
Yeah, and there's an argument to be made, and it comes up in Canada a lot right now, that it's actually in Canada's best interest to do the opposite, to go all in on our relationship with the United States. And I can see that argument, and I understand it, and I understand a lot of the advantages. But I think just on its face, even if Canada were to go all in on its relationship with the US, that would never be reciprocated. And the United States is never going to go all in on its relationship with Canada. And so at a point in time where a tough decision had to be made about trade, sovereignty will always be the better option for a country like Canada. But, if I think about this, and could I ask you through the lens of like John Mersheimer's work, where countries like Canada are often used as leverage points by countries like the United States, and neutral states are seen as risks to powerful states, depending on where they are from a proximity standpoint. Canada shares that large land border with the United States. So how much of a vulnerability, and does this question make sense, how much of a vulnerability is Canada to the United States if it's not US aligned, Pascal?
Well, look, if Canada ever had, like, let's say, a military alliance with China and was stationing Chinese weapons on Canadian soil, that would be a mortal threat to the United States, and the US would have to invade you. Like, period. There's just no way that a great power could let that happen. And we are seeing that with Russia right now in Ukraine, and we know it from 1962, what the US was willing to do to Cuba, or where it was willing to go when Cuba unwisely decided that it is a good idea to allow or to ask the Soviet Union for stationing nukes on their soil. I mean, these kind of threats, direct and real existential threats to great powers, is something that they won't let happen, or they will do anything and everything to prevent them. So in this sense, Canada is condemned to being part of the security environment, the security structure of the United States. But let me just, that has been the case for the last 200 years, and Canada actually fared really well by providing that. And it's not even that Canada doesn't want to do that. I mean, in my perception, Canada and the United States are largely on the same page when it comes to interpretation of international affairs, when it comes to what is desirable, what's not, right? There are, of course, differences naturally, and we all know that also from TVs and so on. And the closer the neighbor, usually the larger we emphasize our differences, and also in cultural output, we make fun of each other and so on. But overall, I would say it is absolutely clear that Canada and the United States have the best of all chances to get along very well with each other, and it makes sense for Canada to be part of the larger geostrategic environment of the United States. Canada can benefit from that a lot. Again, you can benefit from the huge US market. You can benefit from trade deals that also the United States negotiates. And thanks to having access to US markets and so on, you're basically, you profit and benefit as well. The question for states is always like, is it the right kind of balance, or are we being taken advantage of or not? We see how Donald Trump brings up that rhetoric a lot, time and time again, to the point where everybody else says, like, look, you're just being a bully. I mean, you're just portraying yourself as a victim while you're bullying everybody else. But let's put this one aside. The idea we need to maybe not forget about, but seriously curtail, is that sovereignty means that country X can do anything it wants. If Canada decides tomorrow, it can put a man on the moon, it can station Chinese weapons, or it can do whatever it wants, right? Unconstrained, unfeathered freedom. The only country on earth that kind of has that at the moment, the closest thing, is basically Israel, because it can do whatever it wants with impunity, and it breaks every single norm that we have seen. But even Israel is under constraints because action and reaction, right? Even Israel wasn't able to break Iran, at least not in the last round of its war. And so there are constraints. Every country acts under certain constraints. And to me, it makes more sense if we think of international relations not only as a game of bilateral relationships, but also as spheres. And within these spheres, you have different possibilities, spheres of sovereignty. There are certain things Canada can do and Canada can't. So again, I mean, legally and hypothetically possible to station Chinese nukes on Canadian soil. Practically, absolutely, utterly, completely out of the question. And if you try to do, then Canada will be a Ukraine, period. And that's just the constraints we're in. So if we think about that, then the question is, what's the realm of the possible, and how can we negotiate that realm of the possible? And a neutralist strategy would then say that you're not going to put all of your chips into the US boat, right? You maintain some degree of strategic autonomy, but not just in the security realm, like also in the in the economic realm. And you make sure that if, for whatever reason, the US ship sinks, that you still stay afloat. Because if you put everything in, if you're all in, then they go down, you go down. And this is a clear risk that does exist, and you would want to try to mitigate that somehow, I believe. But then again, the people who say like, no, all in, and whatever the US does, we do. And even if it means the US wants to make us the 51st state, so we no more prime minister, but a governor, fine enough. Okay, we're good with that. That's a possible future. It is. The question is it a wise strategy to care for the prosperity of the people living in Canada?
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. So, gross summary: militarily aligned, economically diverse. Right, the strategy for Canada.
I mean, why not? I mean, Canada has also slightly different interests from the United States when it comes to the economy, right? Naturally, and you're also competing with different US states, and giving up on that competition and giving up a large part of your industry just in order to please the hegemon around the corner, that might not be necessary in order to prosper. So again, don't try to break the system, but try to push and figure out where the boundaries are.
So let me ask you. Let's pivot to the Middle East. Let's pivot to Israel. Nice segue there, as you mentioned Israel in your previous response. Last week, the UK, Australia, and Canada decided to recognize the state of Palestine. This obviously set both President Trump and Netanyahu off on a bit of tangents online. My initial response was, watching the announcement from Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the UK, declare his support for the state of Palestine. I just immediately thought of the Balfour Declaration and thought maybe you guys should just sit this one out. Wasn't it a UK initiative that created the modern state of Israel? And maybe your opinion is fine on the sidelines here. So what's your take on that announcement, Pascal? How material is it, and what's the point? What's the point of countries like Canada, the Australia, and the UK recognizing the state of Palestine?
Yeah, and you can add to that, just 12 hours ago, France actually also announced it. It now recognizes Palestine. So let me put it this way. It's an important decision and one that carries potential weight in the future, but it is currently, for the situation, immaterial because it won't change neither the way the Israelis approach their goal of emptying the Palestinian lands of Palestinians, nor will it change the approach to basically genocide Gaza, which now several also UN reports confirmed. And I don't think that we will ever remember this anything differently than as a genocide. But let's put that one aside, because the approach won't be changed. It will only actually, the counter reaction from Israel has been ever since the UK and others announced that they would in the future, like September. They announced this like 3 months ago, right? France too, that they would recognize in September. And already that was weird, because if you want to recognize, just recognize now. You don't need to wait for a UN General Assembly. Yeah. It's really not necessary. That's like just performative. But you could see how they tried to basically assume their own populations, because the anger is rising and the anger is real, even if it's being downplayed and so on. But the European and also in Canada, a large part of the population is not on the same page with the official line of the government, right? And this tension keeps boiling. So one of the ways to diffuse it is by taking a very performative step, in order to tell everybody, look, we're doing things and so on, that has little real world impact. Now, it is important though, because it is part of a general push. So if the street protests and if the outrage about what's happening doesn't stop, if it actually keeps continuing, then these governments are under pressure to continue going in that direction. So in a sense, it's a virtuous salami tactic in order to then get to real political pressure that could actually have real world impact on Israel. And Israel actually said, look, we need to prepare for a future where we need to rely on ourselves, right? They understand that they're losing large parts of the West, which they used to think that, they're just extensions of that. And this is changing. So in that sense, it's important. But in immediately stopping the bombing in Gaza, it won't do that. And it is also meant not to do that, right? Recognizing the state of Palestine is a very strong political statement in order not to do something that could actually hurt Israel, right? Which would be real economic sanctions, which would be not just on certain leaders, right? But actually, let's say, forbidding European ships to use Haifa as a port. That would have an immediate impact, right? And that would be a relatively easy sanction to take. If you look at how easily the European Union was able to put 18 sanctions packages on Russia. I mean, they could do that in one sitting, not one sitting, but within 2 weeks, you could have a sanction package on Israel that would actually hurt Israel, and that would hurt them a lot. But that's not being taken in order not to do that, you actually do the other one. And we've seen these acts also by people like Mr. Merz in Germany, who said okay, we're now going to have a arms embargo on Israel, but an arms embargo with asterisk. So only Germany decided not to export any more weapons that could be used in Gaza to Israel. which is a ridiculous statement, because what kind of weapons can you use in one theater and not in another? But it was meant to basically, be a political statement to one side of the population, say, look, we're doing something. We now have some form of arms embargo. And on Twitter, actually, people were very outraged about that. How come we're standing with the terrorists and so on, like the other side of the debate, right? But in reality, this has no severe impact on the way that Israel will be able to procure weapon systems from the West, not at all. So there's this duplicity in that act. On the other hand, again, if there ever will be a Palestinian state, and if there ever will be a two-state solution, if we ever have a moment when the Palestinians get some form of justice for the last 100 years of European oppression, then it is by such acts, right? And building little by little. And you can see that the Palestinians are of course happy about that, because it gives them more political leverage. Although, in order to become a UN member, you also would need the agreement of the Big Five in the Security Council, and we can be 1,000,000% sure that the United States, current US, won't let that happen. So they are not closer to have a UN seat, but they now have a few ways, diplomatic ways more, and it is first and foremost a pressure campaign, a moral pressure campaign, I would say.
Why do you think it is that countries like Canada, Australia, UK, and France may make statements like this, which I understand public support narrative, we kind of talked about that earlier, that's a different game, but they would not take the step of sanctions? And as you mentioned earlier, Israel is one of, if not the only nation in the world that's able to act with relative impunity, more so than any other country. Why do you think that's the case, Pascal?
I mean, overall, the Euro-Americans, so the Europeans and North Americans, they just still support the Zionist project. And there's different reasons for that. I would say one is culturally grown, because to some level, some people in Europe and the US recognize themselves in the Zionist project. White people settling new land, right, that is proclaimed to be empty. Turns out it's not empty. And if the people who are there resist, then, well, they forfeit their right to live there, and hence they're being genocided. I mean, the North American continent, Canada and the US, they were emptied out of their native populations. I don't think the US has a single political leader in Congress who's actually Native American, right? I mean, the Native Americans are completely, utterly out of the question when it comes to the US. Like they are politically a non-entity, even though a few of them still exist. But that was a completely different question 300 years ago. And in a sense, what we're seeing, the Zionist project, is of course the resettlement of large parts of the European population and Russian and actually from other parts as well in a new land, right? So partially this is the last, or one of the last outgrowths of settler colonialism. On the other hand, we do have political movements that are in large support of this. I mean, in the US, it is the evangelical Christians that, for religious reasons, support Zionism. So that's then where all of the Christian Zionists come from. But funnily enough, in their worldview, in order to go to Judgment Day, you need Israel to build to rebuild the temple on the Temple Mount, and then once that happened, then Judgment Day will come, and that's actually something they want. So it's a really weird reason. But anyhow, so you have this group in Europe. You have. On the one hand, you have the Germans, right, which keep saying that we committed a Holocaust on the Jews, and now we owe them one. I mean, we owe them unconditional support. The Merz and before him, Mr. Scholz. Scholz even said, Israel is the part of the state rationale for Germany to exist. I mean, we that's our debt. Of course, this is a complete misreading of what the guilt of the Holocaust is all about. But fine, there's people who think that never again means never again to the Jews, and if the Jews do it to somebody else, and I must say it's not the Jews, it's the Zionists. We need to differentiate Israelis from Jews from Zionists. It's very important to do that. that. Otherwise, we mischaracterize the situation, and of course, we open up ourselves to the charge of anti-Semitism. The problem is Zionists, and there's a lot of Jews who are not Zionists and a lot of non-Jews who are Zionists, and that group that wants to implement this religiously clean version of a basically European state in the Middle East, they are the ones who are in support of then emptying out these lands, and they are willing to use enormous amounts of violence. And not just against the primary target. I mean, again, the impunity that we have seen is just mind-boggling, to the point where Israel is able to attack a U.S. ally in the Middle East. I mean, Qatar. This again blew my mind. I just didn't think that this could happen. I mean, that they blow up buildings in Qatar. Not only that Qatar is a independent sovereign nation and a UN member state, but it's also one of the US main allies in the Middle East, right? A huge air base down there, which is very important to the US. And the implicit agreement is, of course, that the US provides security. It provides security to Qatar. And now suddenly Qatar finds itself in a situation where its patron allows the other state to bomb them. It's like, okay, what kind of security is that? That's another norm broken, right? It's not just a diplomatic norm, not just a norm between states, not just a UN norm, but also a norm of how people believe the world is running. How Qatar thought it was secure as long as it makes sure that the United States is happy and healthy on its soil. That norm is now broken, and all of this will have necessarily a huge backlash. But the reasons for that is just because there's a lot of people. I mean, in conclusion, it's just a lot of people in Europe and the US who, for different reasons, think it is good to support the Zionist project.
Yes, and when that bombing in Qatar happened, I thought the president of the United States remarks were odd. I think he said, in quotes, "We have to be
we had
careful."
no time. Yeah, we had no time. They informed us too late. There was nothing we could do, you know. It's too bad. Come on. Seriously, you tell me that you have all of these raiders and all of these points, and this is such an important military base right next to Iran, and you don't monitor what's coming in. And because they informed you too late, it's a joke. It's a joke. It's obviously the only question is: did the Americans tell the Israelis to do that, or did the Israelis just do it and told the US that's what's going to happen, and this is how we cover it up? It's a joke. And I think most certainly in the region, people understand it's a joke. So this happened with full consent of the US. It wouldn't happen if it didn't.
When you say eventually there will be a tremendous response to this, do you mean eventually there will be a tremendous response to this impunity being allowed to run rampant for so long? Is that what you mean, Pascal?
No, the counter reactions, you know. I mean, Qatar now obviously needs to think about how to rekindle its security in the region, right? It now needs to be clear that even if you gift a $400 million check to the US president, even if you host all of their troops and everything, you're still not secure. If Israel decides tomorrow that you're part of the problem, then downtown Qatar might look in 2 months very similar to what Gaza looks like now. I mean, this is a rational thing now for the Qataris to think about, and they cannot change the strategy immediately, but they will now rekindle this, right? And we are seeing how Saudi Arabia over the last decade rekindled its security relationship. Just last week, they concluded a defense alliance agreement with Pakistan, and Alexander Mercouris from the Duran analyzed this very, very well. That is not an alliance against the United States, but it is a diversification of a security structure, right? Saudi Arabia understands that the US is not that reliable protector anymore. It cannot be, not just because it's losing economic and industrial power and has constraints, but also because it is so beholden to Israel that the Israel relationship will always always override any other relationship. Hence, you have a problem, right? You don't have the big protector you used to have is not as big anymore. And the threats in the region are much larger. And again, Israel is such a wild card. They are currently fighting 7 wars with 7 of their neighbors, right? I mean, if we include Qatar now as a country that they bombed, they have a war with Lebanon. They have a war in and with Syria. They keep bombing these places. They bomb Iran. They bomb Yemen. I mean, they're in so many theaters involved now that the most logical conclusion for you living in that region is like, look, it's getting really harder and harder. And that's what I mean. So I don't. This impunity at some point will come and bite them again. It's biting them at the United Nations already. It's biting them in the public relations realm, where you can cover up the impunity only for so and so long, especially if you use the victim card like every single time, if that's your strongest card. And they've overplayed that hand. So a lot of like people in the general public see through them. A lot of politicians see through them. A lot of systems now see through that. It has become very plain and clear what Israel is about and after. And this will hurt them over the long run. I'm absolutely certain. Unless they can win all of the wars very quickly, assert their absolute dominance, and basically, we then continue to the next war and forget about it. If they manage to do that, clean everything up, and then just, the genocide was the genocide, and we will revisit in 50 years once everybody is dead anyhow. If they manage to do that, then maybe it's not going to be as dramatic as I'm saying. But if they don't, and if they keep being embroiled in all of this, and if it keeps boiling, it's completely shifting the discourse. The discourse 5 years ago was still like, how do we implement the Oslo agreements? How to get to the 2-state solutions? By now, we're in a completely different discourse.
Yeah. And what does winning 7 wars even look like? Like, how would you even begin to define what some kind of a conclusion would be, right? I just don't even know. Have you been to Israel, Pascal?
No. And I'm not planning on going. I mean, no, I couldn't. I mean, although I would be interested in seeing what it is like, but at the moment I'm just like on a personal level it consumes me too much.
No, that makes
sense. Have you been?
Yeah, I went in 2018. I invested in this company. It was actually like super out there. It was a plant-based baby food company that I invested in 2017. And I met the founder at a technology investment conference I was running in Toronto, in Canada. And I have a little private investment club. And I invited like 8 entrepreneurs out that were running cool private tech companies, and we all watched these pitches together. And it was 2018. So if you remember, this is like the first mainstream crypto rush. So we looked at 8 companies. I think 6 of them were like blockchain or crypto related. And then we saw this sort of food technology company. And I had just had my first son, and he had this aversion to dairy. And in the investment club, there was like 6 other brand new dads, and the aversion to dairy was common. So when we heard this pitch, it like resonated. Anyways, she was an absolute pit bull, the kind of entrepreneur where you're like, I don't care what you're building, I'm all in on what you're doing. Anyways, they're based in Tel Aviv, and they flew us out a year and a half later to just see the operation. But it was cool. I like, while I was there, I went to Jerusalem, went to the Temple Mount, walked the Via Dolorosa, went to the Black Sea, the Dead Sea. Really glad that I did exactly when I did, right? Glad that I got that opportunity in 2018 to get out there. And
we must not demonize Israel. Obviously, the solution needs to be one where the people on this land are able to live and prosper together, right? The bad thing is that we have political ideologies and actors on that land that really have very, very, in my view, unhealthy ideas of what a prosperous land between the river and the sea looks like. And that's a huge tragedy. I mean, obviously it's beautiful. Obviously it's a great land, right? I mean, I don't think the Palestinians would all want to stay on their land if it wasn't that beautiful, right? And the Israelis probably wouldn't want to be there either if it wasn't beautiful, right? It's a great place, and it's obviously has great people, as people are great everywhere. So the political tragedy we need to overcome is these toxic ideological views of what a good society looks like.
Yeah, 100%. Wow. Pascal, it's always great chatting with you. Thanks so much for making the time today. I'm excited to see you in Osaka in a few short days. I'll be out there hitting Kyoto with a couple buddies and then meeting up with you in Osaka. Looking forward to that. Thanks so much for coming on today. I appreciate it.
I'm looking forward to meeting you in Osaka, and thank you very much for your interest and the questions. And yeah, we'll talk more over dinner.
Let me ask you a question before we wrap up here. For anybody who's super curious about going deeper into any of these sort of geopolitical topics, I mean, first of all, I'd point them to Neutrality Studies, your YouTube channel. It's like the first sort of neutrality-focused research organization that you founded. Where else would you, and your content's excellent, by the way.
Thank you.
Congratulations on the success of the channel. What are your main sources, Pascal? Where do you go to stay up to date on important geopolitical trends?
Well, it's it's at the same time difficult and easy. It's difficult is like, okay, what kind of depth of analysis do you want? So one thing I can recommend is, read a couple of the important books. I mean, Mearsheimer, or if you want something about, let's say, the Chinese political system, I mean, Google it and figure out a good book published by a nice university publisher or any kind of good publisher, right? And then read that. So go and use a book in order to get a little bit of context of stuff. And then the easy thing is, I mean, all we need to do is to Google things. So you go and you read the different newspapers, or you don't even need to read them. You look at the headlines and try to understand how is stuff being framed in The Guardian, in the New York Times, in Russia Today, in the Japan Times, take your pick. But the important thing is we need to compare. Unfortunately, the times are over where we could just like rely on one newspaper and then blissfully believe that we are well informed. We're not. But you read just what is the general chatter about, and then you get the large overview. And then, seriously, YouTube is just an amazing platform. It has some crap, but it also has a lot of very good content. I mean, the fact that we can hear Mearsheimer in the original almost on a daily basis, and Jeffrey Sachs, but also French analysts and European analysts and Chinese analysts who also speak to us. It's not always easy to find them. I mean, some of them might just show up in your feed. So do explore also in your own feed and see if you find people who say intelligent things. You follow them. I would say it's one of the largest. It's probably the largest platform now for this kind of IR discourse. There's other platforms. I don't recommend Twitter. Twitter just makes you angry and it's too short form. Substack, by the way. Substack is a good platform for long form essays. They have good analysts as well, and people just publish there now. So for current discourse, that's not at all bad to stay up to date with the analysis. And I get a lot of one channel that I just find amazing with the depth of analysis is Alexander Mercouris, the Duran. He does an amazing job at every day, 90 minutes of news. And of course, as with everybody, you can't completely trust them because people also make mistakes and people only choose what they want to talk about, right? So we still need to compare, but there's very, very good analysts out there.
The Duran's an excellent podcast. So is Brian Berletic, who you put me on to last time we spoke. I agree. And again,
I don't trust everything he says, but it's very good to know because he's a very good brain, just as a lot of others are good brains. And then the job we have to do is to use our brains to compare and figure out what we choose to believe about how the world runs.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt. I'm presently reading my way through John Mearsheimer's work, really enjoying it. You wrote a book called Sweden, Japan, and the Long Second World War, published in 2022. Could you walk my audience through that thesis, Pascal? I'm really curious about the inspiration for the book and what the reader takeaway.
The book is an outcome of my dissertation. I wrote my dissertation about Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland in the Second World War. And by the time I finished the dissertation, each one of them was a chapter. I realized they had so much, I realized Spain had already been worked on a lot by others, so I left that aside. But the Sweden and Switzerland, I had so much material that I said I could have a book on each one of them. And I started with Sweden with the idea that if I screw it up, I don't screw up my Switzerland, I screw up Sweden. But turned out I worked with a Swedish researcher, and it became a good book. It became a good narrative about 15 years of Japan's experience of war. Of course, self-inflicted. I mean, self-done, right? The Japanese chose to go to war in 1931 and start with clipping off a part of China from China and create this state Manchukuo, and it lasted all the way till 1945. 80 years ago, right? And in those 15 years, the interesting thing to me was to look at the interactions with states that were not allies of Japan, but not enemies either. So those are the neutrals, right? And Sweden and Switzerland both had a relationship with Japan, and the Swedish diplomats were able to do things in Japan, and Japan was able to do things through Sweden in Stockholm, in their embassies. And so the book is all about that. How did that bilateral relationship work out? As I said earlier, right? Even during war, the relationship is still a bilateral one, right? And with some states, Japan was at war, like the US and Britain and France. And with others, it was in an alliance, like Germany and Italy. With some, it was neutral, like Sweden, Switzerland, and the Soviet Union. Right? So even though the Soviet Union was an ally of the others, it was not an enemy of Japan. And this configuration is highly interesting. And so the book itself is focusing on a small neutral and what the small neutral then did and why they did that. I mean, why did Sweden not just say like, okay, in 41 or 42, we're going to pack up, we're leaving. And the book is about that. And the short answer is states are very, very careful with breaking relationships if they don't have to. So until the very end, it just seemed more profitable for Sweden to maintain a good relationship with Japan. And it made no sense for them because they thought from their perspective, it's like, yeah, sure, you're on the losing end of the Second World War, but until very late, it wasn't clear what that would actually mean. So the incentive was to maintain and stay, and then you engage in activities, including humanitarian activities, but also business activities until the very end. On the last submarines that still reached Japan from Europe, you still had people transporting Swedish piano wire, because that was the hardest wire steel you could get, and it's important in the wings of airplanes. So trade until the very end. I mean, it went to almost nothing, but the highest value trade was maintained until 1945.
Right. Fascinating. Fascinating.
Yeah. That's right. That's what it's about.